I'll have one say hi to you. This is Roscoe. That's Roscoe the pug, my other child. And then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So you won't see me on video for a sec, and you're going to see several screens, and then we'll go ahead and we'll begin. Okay. So I'm going to turn off the camera. And just to let you know a little about me, I don't know if you know where I'm from. Does anybody know where I'm at right now? Yes, I in the United States, in Texas, exactly. And can you see my screen?
Yeah.
You can see it? Okay, great, great. Well, I've taught learners in over 20 different countries. I used to live in Germany and also in Greece for a while, teaching learners of all ages from 2 to 90. I'm of a Mexican-American descent, so it's Shelly Sanchez Terrel. So I came, my family came here to the United States from another country as well. And I think fairy tales are really wonderful because the great thing about fairy tales is that they're international. So every culture, every country has their own fairy tales. A lot of them are very, very similar, but there are some key differences. And that has a lot to do with the purpose of fairy tales. So I don't know if you know why fairy tales came about. And so think about that because I'll ask you that later on. The other great thing is that fairy tales aren't actually just, sometimes we think they're just for children. One of the reasons we think that is because they have animated characters. Disney is one of the reasons we think that as well, because Disney has made these awesome movies and awesome, animated movies geared towards children. But if you really read fairy tales from a lot of different cultures, they have a lot of really scary elements in them. So a lot of researchers, adults, people from around the world really like to look at fairy tales. And one of the reasons why is because fairy tales came about way before there was even a printing press, before we even had these pictures to see them. So fairy tales are very, 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 very old. And also fairy tales are an oral tradition, which means that they started out as adults telling these fairy tales to children. So these fairy tales were created and then they were preserved and passed down by telling them and sharing them. And then the children would memorize them and then share them with their children. So fairy tales are even before books, and that's really interesting as well. I don't know if you've seen the movie Coraline, but that's actually more twist on a fairy tale. It's a little bit dark and it's a real gothic. So that tends to appeal to a lot more older learners as well. And you've seen a lot of different movies kind of make darker kinds of, fairy tales, or use fairy tale characters in much darker kind of settings. And that's because if we think of even some of the most very popular fairy tales, they are pretty dark. When I was living in Germany, one of the interesting facts about that is that I only lived about 30 minutes away from Germany's fairy tale city. You would travel to the city. It was called Ludwigsburg. It's called Ludwigsburg. And there was a huge palace. And every time you go to the palace, and we went there all the time, there was a free park in the palace. And in the park, there were different types of buildings that were constructed to show you about different types of fairy tales, because two of the most, the ones who publish fairy tales, they're called the Grimm's brothers, and there's even a show about it, Once Upon a Time, based on those. And so it's really cool because you'll go to like a building and there's like a little castle, and you can say Rapunzel, but it's more in like German. Everything is German, but you just call, and then actual like long blonde hair comes out, so it comes down the window. And so it's a really, really cool park. So I really think that fairy tales are really interesting, and I've been lucky to be able to be surrounded by different kinds of experiences like that. Now, I know this is part of a cultural project that you're doing, and it's really wonderful that you're using fairy tales because there's so much that you can do with this. I understand you're creating your own fairy tales. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And will you be doing this in partners or by yourself or as a class? Okay, good. So I think that that's a great way to do it. So that way you have many different types of fairy tales that you get to create. And I'm going to show you some parts of a fairy tale so you understand, you know, what's the different, what they are supposed to have in them. You don't have to have all of these elements, but it's good to have a good portion of them. So before we see those, fairy tales, I want to show you the great reason why they're good to have a global collaboration project. When we think of fairy tales, it was very interesting because you hear all these fairy tales from your culture. And then when you see something or read another fairy tale from another country, they have a different twist. This happened with me when I was very surprised by this when I was in high school, and I read The Little Mermaid, the version from Japan, and in that version there is not a happily ever after. So even though so some of the elements I'm going to show you are not necessarily based on all cultures, because that tends to be one of the elements is there is a happily ever after, but in a lot of Japanese fairy tales there isn't. So are you familiar with The Little Mermaid?
Yeah.
Okay, and how does that end? Does anybody remember how that ends? I think in the Disney one, she turns into a human and gets the prince and lives happily ever after. But in the Japanese version, she actually turns into seaweed and she doesn't live happily ever after. So I was very, very surprised about that. And I started looking at different types of ways that fairy tales were different. And I think you've already shared some fairy tales from the different countries, or you haven't done that yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Yes, some of them. Okay. Well, I'll show you some places where you can even investigate further. Um, One of the reasons why fairy tales began, does anybody have any reasons why? Why do you think that parents would tell fairy tales and share these with children, even though they were very scary? And that even when a lot of them were, you know, before bedtime. So why would they do that? Why would they share? If you think about, you know, some famous fairy tales, Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood. Why do you think that they would share the fairy tales with them?
I think that sharing fairy with kids at a tender age can help them develop a nice imagination.
Yes, definitely. That's one reason, because they can develop imagination. Exactly. They can think about, you know, knights and dragons and mythical themes, magic. And so, yeah, that's definitely one reason. Why would, and then how about any other reasons?
Any other reason?
Entertaining.
Entertainment, yes, there, I mean, this is before they had mobile devices and TVs and movies and anything really electric. I mean, and sometimes, this was before even light was, invented, in electricity. So definitely this is a way to also communicate, um, share knowledge, because remember, there weren't really any books. So kids, this was a great teaching tool for them. It was a great way for them to learn vocabulary. And then also it was a great way to teach them about values and morals. And especially with the darker ones, Little Red Riding Hood, she goes into the forest and she meets a scary wolf. If you think of Hansel and Gretel, they go into the forest, they meet a witch. And so some of these darker fairy tales were because they worked so much, parents, had to make everything from scratch. They had to milk the cows, they had to make soap, they had to do all of this. And so they didn't have a lot of time to watch the kids, and they wanted to make sure they didn't go into the forest, especially in the dark, because they didn't have advanced technology to be able to find kids. Kids could easily get lost in forests and in the dark. And so that would be something that was very scary for parents. And so that's how a lot of fairy tales began, is because they wanted to have a way that children would listen. When your parents or your teachers say, don't do this, you usually tend to still do it because that's not very convincing. But if you have this fairy tale, and there's a description of a scary witch who can, trap you and look at your finger and maybe eat you, well, as a child, you might be scared enough to actually stay away from the woods. So a lot of fairy tales began because of this. And also it shared some myths. Sometimes in a lot of cultures, they actually believed this. They believed in witches. And you've seen, maybe you've read some history about, people that were actually thought to be witches, and a very dark time in history when they actually would, take, they really believed in witches. And then also there's some universal themes. There's themes, if we think of fairy tales, there's universal themes of, royalty. And so back in the days, there was really rich people um, who were kings and queens and princesses. So that really did exist. And then there were really poor people, very, 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 very poor, who had nothing. And they usually, worked around the castles. And so they got to see this. And it was such a huge income bracket that this was also a way to tie those two economic situations together. This was a way, in most fairy tales, you'll see that there's poor people and really, really, really rich people. And so that tends to be an element as well. And also this was a way to somehow also preserve history, and to be able to pass down that history as well. So one place that you're able to look and evaluate different types of fairy tales is fairytalesoftheworld.com. This is really good because you can search by location, and then you can be able to see the different ways that fairy tales end, or the differences within them, and the characters as well. Or if you know a famous author, then you can also start reading there. One idea is to actually look at the location, to put in your location, and to be able to see which fairy tales actually are there, and see if they do match the written narrative that's there, or the text that's there, if it actually matches what you've heard or what you remember that was passed down to you. And then with that, you can compare the differences in fairy tales. And that's really helpful because when you think of the values that are in the fairy tales, especially with fairy tales that you grew up with, think about when you're before you create this, with your partner, write down what kind of values or morals that you're taught. So for example, when we think of Snow White, when we think of she takes an apple, and what happens when she takes that apple?
It's poison.
Yeah, she's poisoned. So, what kind of lesson would that teach? What is the what lesson do you learn from that?
Not trust strangers.
Yeah, or not to accept anything from strangers. Just don't eat, and that's actually very applicable today. We know a lot of cases, where if you get a drink, or you get certain foods or anything, that sometimes it can be tainted. So you can look at the different elements of well, first of all, you can talk about which are your favorite fairy tales, or the ones you remember the most, with whoever you're working with, and then try to think of things like that. Okay, so what happens, and what are the lessons that they're trying to teach you about life? What are important lessons? And that'll really help you with your fairy tale, because then what you can do is think about what are lessons today, that, or are there the same kind of lessons that are still applicable today? Are they still important? What's important for children, or even as they develop, what is important for them to know to survive in life? And so it's good to be able to do that. Why use fairy tales? Well, fairy tales are great for learning because, of course, it's one way to learn English, because you're familiar with the plot of many different types of fairy tales. You can always see the movie, because pretty much every single fairy tale is animated. You can find a YouTube video for it. There's tons of YouTube videos for fairy tales. You can often find them translated from one language to English. You can also, be able to, get several books about them as well. And the great thing about it is here, that one point you brought up, which was it sparks imagination and creativity. So they're really great because fairy tales are fun to write. So writing your fairy tale, you actually get to use your imagination, and definitely try to be creative. Think about a lot of times, especially in writing, you don't necessarily get to test the limits of your imagination. You don't get to put magical elements and different types of creatures that are invented that can do things like fly, or many other things, or have a magical wand, or something like that. So definitely be creative, something that gets your mind to spark that creativity. The other great thing is, because you've learned about fairy tales since you were children, then you're able to also understand, different elements already about a fairy tale. It's a familiar kind of story. And when we writing is actually very, very hard, especially creative writing. Creative writing is harder than a research paper, because with creative writing, it's all from you. It's all you and your partner. So you have to come up with this narrative, and you have to be creative and inventive, and that can be very unfamiliar to a lot of people. It's really hard for people to write in creative stories, but because fairy tales have a common plot, and they have the same kind of beginning, and they have the same kind of ending, most of them, then you're able to have that format to help you. So those elements and those formats will really help you. This is also, when you write a fairy tale, if you do see that you get very excited about it, and you do really like this activity, this might be a way for you to start writing more creatively. So it's a great way to teach you how to be a creative writer. So let's talk about the characters in fairy tales, in most fairy tales. So there's definitely always a hero, okay? And then this is actually from a book which researched, his name was Vladimir Prupp. And he researched fairy tales and wrote a whole entire book about fairy tales called The Morphology of the Fairy Tale. It's at the bottom, but you can't really see the title. And so what I'm sharing with you is actually from this book um, by Vladimir Prupp. And so these are the 6 different characters he saw in most fairy tales. And so we have the hero, which is something, usually it's a knight who goes and saves a princess. If one of the fun fairy tales that I like a lot is Shrek. And so that kind of makes a twist on the whole fairy tale, the way fairy tales are, because Shrek is the hero. And there's someone that helps the hero. Are you all familiar with Shrek?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So who would be the helper of Shrek? Yeah, the donkey. Exactly, the donkey. And the villain, do you remember who the villain was? Yeah, he, he was part of the royal court there. So yeah, there was definitely a villain there. A lot of times the villain is a witch. You'll notice in a lot of different fairy tales. If we look at Little Red Riding Hood, who's the villain there? Oh yes, the wolves is a lot. Sometimes it's wolves or scary creatures as well. He says there's also a false hero. False hero is the one who tries to look like a hero, but then really isn't. So this kind of gets in the way of the real hero. But that's not always in all fairy tales. There's also a dispatcher. The dispatcher, that's kind of a weird term. It's not usually, it's a term that Vladimir made up, but this is the person that sends the hero off, that gives him a lot of wisdom. So the dispatcher would be more like, are you all familiar with Star Wars? Okay, so the dispatcher would be someone like Yoda, someone who trains the hero or offers him some kind of special knowledge or help, so that way he can go do what he's supposed to do to be able to, live happily ever after or rescue whoever. So that's Yoda would be like a dispatcher. And then there's a donor. There's somebody who gives the hero something like, a lot of times, like the Princess and the Pea, at the end, they get the princess and they get the kingdom. The donor is the one who gives them, whatever kind of prize or reward for succeeding. So not only do they live happily ever after, but usually there's also a way that that person gets all of these riches. Now you'll notice that in some of these, it's a way that really poor people actually get to live happily ever after. And this was not a reality that was really presented back then, in a lot of different cases. So for example, with Cinderella, she was, she was a cleaner. She was always cleaning. She had this life where, she didn't get to go to balls or anything like that. But then she goes to a ball and, being from her bad situation, all of a sudden, at the end, she is able to come into this very, very luxurious royal life and have a happily ever after. So fairy tales were also a way to give hope. A lot of people, now we have the internet, we have access. You can do pretty much, you know, you can live your dreams and your passions and share them. But back then they had very limited, whatever they were born into, you know, if they were born as a serf or in poverty, then that's the way they stayed the rest of their lives, for a lot of different people around the world. So it was, fairy tales were also a way to give hope. And now that's something that we have a lot more of, because with the internet you can do so many things, you know. So according to Vladimir, he says there's 31 steps in most in a lot of fairy tales. I think he's talking about much longer fairy tales, because definitely there's not 31 steps in every fairy tale, like Little Red Riding Hood, even Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So some fairy tales don't have all of these steps, but I do want to share them with you, because that way you can use some of these different elements. You don't have to worry about memorizing all of this, because if you look at the bottom, well, at the end I'll share with you at shellyterrel.com/fairytale. You'll have access to the slides so you can review them, and then there's also bookmarks and things like that, and so you'll be able to look at this and then be able to use these elements in your fairy tale. So most fairy tale structures go in this step. This is the way the plot is. The hero leaves home. So that is a common element. A hero always leaves home. Shrek leaves. Little Red Riding Hood leaves. Hansel and Gretel, they leave to the forest. Goldilocks, she leaves. So there's definitely whoever is the main character leaves their home. The hero is told not to do something or go somewhere, and does it anyway. So Jack and the Beanstalk, he's told, you know, not to. So if you think of you know, that's definitely an element too. So the great thing is that your hero gets to be rebellious, because basically the hero is not listening. Okay. So that could be kind of fun, that you can have this rebellious hero. The other part is that a lot of the heroes, and I think he mixes the terms sometimes, because sometimes the person who leaves home is the main character and not necessarily the hero, the main hero. Like in Little Red Riding Hood, the person who really saves everyone in some versions is actually the hunters, the woodsman. So he would kind of be the hero. But, you know, in this situation, it's usually the main character is the one that leaves home. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the hero. But in Shrek, he leaves home and he's the hero. So the hero also meets, has a villain, and the villain, the word villain means someone that represents evil. You know, they're the bad person. The villain tries to get a treasure, whether the treasure is that they want the princess, like in Shrek, you know, they want the kingdom and the princess, or in some, like Rumpelstiltskin, he wants the firstborn child of the girl. You know, so there's always something that a villain tries to get. And the villain uses tricks. You know, the villain isn't, and that's one thing to think about when you're thinking of the villain. Remember, villains are in fairy tales are very smart. They're smart enough to be able to fool the hero. So we think, for example, the wolf. The wolf, and that's the other thing, is that, you know, the wolf can talk. So animals can talk, creatures can talk. And the wolf is very cunning. He's very smart. He's able to gain even though he looks, I mean, can you think about, if you imagine it, imagine going to forest and you're meeting a wolf that talks. And I mean, definitely you would probably be scared. I mean, if I saw a wolf, I would be definitely scared. But he is able to get, even though he looks very scary and like a villain, he's able to gain the trust somehow of the main character and fool them at first. So when you make your villains, then think about that. You know, this is a smart villain. They have to, what kind of tricks or what kind of words? They have to be really good communicators, and they have to be good at, you know, reading people and getting them to trust them. So they're very good speakers, and so they're able to fool a lot of people. And then the villain either harms someone or harms some kind of property. So who does the wolf harm in Little Red Riding Hood?
The grandmother.
Yeah, the grandma, exactly. And so the villain usually, yes, harms somebody, and then the hero discovers a misfortune and helps someone, and then he or she realizes, okay, this villain, after they discover that you know someone was harmed or something like that, then they have to decide, okay, how am I going to defeat um, this very smart villain? Okay, so that's what it means by counteraction decided upon. And often the hero can have some help in fairy tales. So when we think of Hansel and Gretel, they realize at first, you know, there's a scary witch. The witch looks scary, and then she's able to trick the two children by giving them candy or tempting them with candy, and then she traps them, and then they have to figure out, Hansel and Gretel, how to escape. So they that's what the counteraction means, like, you know, how, what is their plan for escape? So you have to think of, you know, a plan to defeat the situation that they've come into, because that way they're able to escape that situation or be able to defeat the villain. So then the hero is tested, helped, or attacked. You know, and that happens in, you know, Hansel and Gretel. They get stuck. In Little Red Riding Hood, you know, it's the wolf. And then the hero reacts. Sometimes the hero has a donor or someone who helps them pass tests, solve problems, and that's not in every single. And that's not in every single fairy tale. That's more like, you know, when the Jedi Knights are going through Jedi training and things like that. But you can have that inside your story, especially if it's a longer story. Somehow the hero obtains some kind of new intelligence, or they obtain some kind of magic, or they're helped with magic in some way. So when we think of Cinderella, you know, what is the magic that helps her? So there's a fairy with the wand, and she's, you know, able to, she's the one who has the magic, and, you know, she's able to help her and, you know, use that magic to help her. So you can think of, you know, some way that, you know, magic helps the hero. The hero then, you know, reaches the treasure, which is, you know, either to rescue the prince, or, I mean, rescue the princess usually. In Snow White, you know, the hero is the prince who, you know, kisses her. Sometimes, you know, there's a lot of kissing in fairy tales, like the Frog Prince, where, you know, they kiss the frog and the princess kisses the frog, and then, you know, the frog turns into a prince. So it might be something like that, you know, a magical kiss, or it could be like a wand, or something that's magical. The hero and the villain have some kind of, you know, confrontation where they either fight and you know, the hero wins. Sometimes the hero gets an injury, is what he says. That's not always that doesn't always happen. But, you know, your hero could get an injury, and then the villain is defeated. Everything, you know, is resolved. The hero heads home, and basically, there's a happily ever after. Now, there's some other ones, some other elements here, but I don't necessarily think that these are all part of, you know, a lot. Depending, you know, how long are these fairy tales going to be? Do you have like a page limit or anything?
5 years.
We didn't decide yet.
Oh, okay. So depending, you don't, like I said, you don't have to have, 10 of these elements to be really good. I've covered the most important ones that are there, which I think are the first actual 20. And then the end, which is the hero lives happily ever after. Of course, if you have some freedom, then definitely you can switch that around, and I'll show you how that works out as well. Oh, one way to really help you plan this, because that was a lot of elements there for a checklist, is to use some kind of graphic organizer or something like this. This is actually, and I'm sure your teachers will give you something that's similar, or some resources like that. But usually with writing a very, very long piece of work, a lot of authors use something like what's called a storyboard or story map. And this is, I'll show you a few different samples. So this is a story map. It's called Once Upon a Time. And because how does okay, so this is one of the most important elements. How does every single fairy tale begin? Yes, exactly. So once upon a time so that's very helpful, because the first line to begin with in your fairy tale, which is once upon a time. Okay, so definitely that's, and then the end is, and they lived happily ever after. So the first line and the last line, if you want to make a typical fairy tale, you can decide together the title. You'll write your names as the authors, who's gonna be the main characters. Now we saw that the main characters are the hero. Also, usually, so there's the hero or the main or the protagonist, or what a protagonist is called. The main character, and they represent good. They're a good person. They might make mistakes, but they still represent good. And what I mean by mistakes, or they might be rebellious, but that still mean they're still good. Okay, they might not be very good listeners, but they learn a lesson and become better at the end. And then you have to think of who's the villain. So you have your hero, your protagonist, your villain. Those are three main characters, and the helper. That's four. So that's four characters that are main characters in the fairy tales. And then you have supporting characters. Supporting characters can be, family members. It could be, if there's a princess, that if you decide, there's a prince and a princess, then you can, their parents, villagers. I mean, you can have as many supporting characters. Um, and the villain always represents evil. Now, there are a lot of people who have a problem with fairy tales doing that, because fairy tales, an element is that they're very, they don't make a gray area. You're either good or you're evil. So that's a main theme in a lot of fairy tales, is good versus evil, and good wins. Okay, so that's an element in a lot of different fairy tales. So think about the setting. You can have you can either think about some of the really great landmarks, especially that look kind of mythical. When I was living in Europe, there's tons of places. I mean, there's castles everywhere that I would explore. I think I went to at least 100. So there is a lot of great places that I would be able to really put a fairy tale setting. But it's really cool if you make it somewhere local, something that, can have, that you can, the setting, you'll be able to, since you're sharing these with another country, you'll be able inside your fairy tale to teach them about, a location, and they'll be able to, learn about that location. So that could be really, really interesting. And the beginning, think of how you want to introduce this, where is it going to begin, and then the middle, and then the ending. What's the problem, or the situation that the hero is going to get in, and then in the end, what's going to happen, what's going to be the happily ever after. There's a really good resource where you can actually, it walks you through this in the, where you can go through a computer program. It's free, and it's on Read, Write, Think. So you can have the link to that. But there's so many different resources on there. There's like 5 different graphic organizers. So I'll show you the ones that it shares with you, which is the story map, which is this is what it looks like. And that's because we're all different types of writers. So you can decide, which kind of mapping is good for you, or, to do something like this, you can easily do this on your own sheet of paper, or to really help you brainstorm and plan your fairy tale. Think about the characters. What do they look like? How do they so this is a character map, so that you can really think about the characters and really make them come to life. Think about their personalities and really get them to have, because the villain is smart. It's good to think about, what kind of tricks can that villain use? What does that villain look like? Is that villain going to be a mythical creature? Are they going to have magic powers like a witch? Can they cast spells? What do they have that's able to help make them very powerful? And then when we think of the hero, where does the hero come from? Is this going to be a rich hero? Is this going to be a hero that is in a poor area? And what does the hero learn from, or what is the, strengths of the hero? What makes that hero interesting? What do they like to do? Are they into like, certain things? So really developing the characters. And then when you think about what the hero goes through, or the main, what happens, the climax, as we call it, to the conflict, what happens, how does what is the hero face that, or the protagonist, that the main character, that, really, that they have to solve. And they do solve it. How do they solve it? How do they solve this? And why are they faced with this conflict? Usually it's because they're rebellious and they don't listen. So that could be part of it, part of, them, what didn't they listen to? What kind of advice that they, had to learn on their own? And then there's also this resolution map they give you, which is, what is the how do they solve it? What happens when, what is their happily ever after? What do they gain by solving it? And how do they get to live happily ever after? So some more general elements that are found in fairy tales. And then we'll go ahead and wrap up, so you can ask me any questions. So it always begins with once upon a time. And when we think of the once upon a time, when you think of the beginning of a fairy tale, fairy tales are very interesting in the beginning. Your introduction for any kind of creative writing has to have a lot of adjectives. It really has to grab the attention of whoever is reading the fairy tale. So it's good to look at a lot of the beginnings and see how they make it interesting. They're really good about describing a setting, because remember, back then they didn't really get to travel much. So they really did, and they didn't have where they got to see a lot of pictures and things like that. So they really did have to use their imagination. They had to use strong adjectives to be able to describe what it was. So think of you don't want to say once upon a time in, a kingdom far, because that's kind of boring. But if you say, once upon a time in an enchanted kingdom that was the size of 2 cities, and it had, golden roofs made of, $1 million gold, where it sounds like you're excited about, this is a really wonderful place, and they were flying unicorns around it. So you want to make it sound very interesting, grab, the attention of the whoever's going to read it. There's definitely fantasy and make believe. So you can really use your imagination, come up with some, really great mythical characters. You can think of some famous ones that are, that maybe through history, like for example, in Mexican history, we have a lot of mythical characters from our culture. So we have things like a really scary, instead of a wolf, we have something called a chupacabra. So we have, which is very, very, very scary. And so, you can think of creatures or that are common, that you grew up with, that could be very common for your particular culture. Now, remember, when you're making these fairy tales, you do want to put some cultural elements, because you'll be sharing them with people from, or another class from another country, and that way they get to learn. This is one way they learn about your culture. Not only the setting can have elements of where you live, but also they can learn a little bit about history and mythical creatures from that you grew up with as well. And then, there's usually enchanted settings. There's a really, really poor area, but what's really out there, uh, the main character is really poor. They want to be able to get to this really, magical place, and be able to, be in this really beautiful area. So, enchanted settings you can have. So those of you who are good at math or puzzles or anything like that, you'll like this part of fairy tales. There's usually patterns and numbers. So for example, Goldilocks, there's 3 bears. And then it repeats common themes, like, the first, from the first one that she tastes, like, is what? The first porridge she tastes is what? Do you remember the temperature? Yeah, too cold, too cold. Yeah. And then there was one that was too hot, and then just right. So usually there's two, and then at the third one, it's just right for her. And a lot of different fairy tales. I think in Rumpelstiltskin, he calls 3 is an important number in a lot of fairy tales. Rumpelstiltskin, I think you have to say, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, pull down your hair, like 3 times before I think she actually does it. And I think in Ludwigsburg, in the castle, it's the same way. Like, it won't come out until you do it. Like, you say it 3 times. So there's usually some kind of number or pattern, and I believe it's 3, 7, and 11 are very popular ones for a lot of fairy tales. So you can think about that if you think of chants or anything like that. There's usually a problem or conflict. Of course, there's, that the hero faces. Here, he was turned into a frog and has to live the rest of his life as a frog, unless, he happens to be kissed by a wonderful princess. So that's the, problem that he faces. And then there's a climax. There's, that fight, or the time when they face, and then they're able to get some victory, and that's like supposed to be the really exciting part that really gets people anticipating. The climax is supposed to make readers feel tense, rooting for the hero, and really hoping the villain gets defeated in some way. There's also a resolution, and then they also call it a denouement. That's just a more scholarly term for it, according to Vladimir. And so, there's some way that magic, helps, resolve the situation, that the hero is able to complete, to successfully be able to pass the task, defeat the villain, and be able to learn something through this journey that the hero has. And then there's also the happily, and I spelled that wrong, it should be, but the happily ever after. What is, not only does the hero go through this and face a problem, a major problem, defeat a villain, but by doing that, that hero, that impacts their entire life. Like, that's such a big, when we think about it, when we face problems all the time, and that doesn't, necessarily mean that we're going to live happily ever after, or that, but in fairy tales, that does happen. You are able to, pass this huge problem, this conflict, and then this impacts the rest of your life, where you actually, with Cinderella, she no longer has to be this. She no longer has to scrub floors and clean every day. She gets to actually live in a big palace. If we think of Snow White, then she doesn't get to be poor anymore. She doesn't have to live with her evil step mother or anything like that. The Frog Prince, he doesn't have to live his days as a frog anymore. He gets to be a prince again. So there are huge, differences from their life at the beginning of the story to the end. So that's something to think about too. And then, what is the universal lesson? What are the things that your fairy tale is going to teach? How is it going to, what kind of lesson do you want, the people reading it to be able to walk away with? And that's really important as well, because that's the main reason that fairy tales exist, is because they were a way for families to be able to pass down values and morals and protect children and get them to have steps to be able to have a very safe or good life. And so the lessons that are learned are very, very important. I think that the elements of a fairy tale, this makes all of that a little bit easier. You can actually evaluate some fairy tales or come up with your own. And then when you evaluate different fairy tales, if you haven't done this, you can, write down the title, Little Red Riding Hood, check off whenever you see, or write down what this has in it. Once upon a time, yes, check that off. What is the magic or enchanted setting? And so that way it can help you evaluate those elements that I've just talked about. Or this one's really great. This one's Little Red Cap from Grimm's Fairy Tale. But you can use this for any kind of fairy tale to write down the character, the setting, the problem solution. Or you can use this to even, create your own fairy tale. And then here's another little chart to be able to evaluate that too, or Little Red Riding Hood or anything like that, and be able to see those different elements and how they're described. There are some common themes or motifs. That's the scholarly term for it. There's usually some kind of a word game. Like, for example, in Rapunzel, there's a lot of different word games there. If you read the wolf's speech, the wolf has a lot of word games. There's he tries to trick. The poor is somehow ends up rich or successful. There's also themes about guardians, protectors. Families are sharing this to be able to have them face problems. So definitely families are part of that and want to protect children. So they become part of the story too. There's some kind of monsters or mythical creatures. There's themes of quests and traveling tales, going through a journey of some sort. And remember, they couldn't go through very long journeys, but now you can. So that's really great. Human weaknesses and human strengths. In fairy tales, they show that, what is a weakness. A weakness can be that we can be very gullible and naive. Fairy tales, a lot of them, what they try to show is how naive or gullible you are until you get to leave home. So that was an important lesson too, is, a lot of the families, they didn't have, McDonald's or malls or anything like that to go to meet other people. They were at home a lot of time, the children. So the children were very protected because they were at home. So parents knew that when they left the home, when they, had to go seek work or anything like that, that they were going to have to face a lot of differences in the world. And that's something you'll have to do too whenever you leave school and you become an adult and, decide where you're going to travel to work or go to school or college or something, or, whatever happens in life, you're going to face a lot of things, tasks and things like that. So it is a traveler's tale in quest, like what you face and what you learn from it. And then remember, you can have talking objects and talking animals and things like that. There's always some kind of impossible task, magic words and phrases. Sometimes there's abracadabra, there's some kind of chant or something like that. Good versus evil. There's the young versus the old. The old is trying to pass down knowledge. The young doesn't want to listen at first and then is able to see that. There's a lot of sleep in a lot of fairy tales. The characters end up sleeping a lot. There's some kind of key or a path to be able to get through some kind of door or obstacle or something like that. And then there's gluttony versus starvation. Gluttony is something like, very rich people were so rich and they never shared with the poor. A lot of them were not very good people, the kings and things like that. And then there was very poor people who starved way back. So, and even, now that exists too, but back then it really, really did exist. And so there was a lot of that in fairy tales. So some ideas, and I'm not sure, what you get to do with yours, but a lot of different authors have actually published books where they've taken a fairy tale and they've changed either the point of view, they put a different ending, or they changed the setting. So I don't know if you'll be able to do that, take a fairy tale and then just change it in somehow. And then here are some recommended book creators, but of course, I think that your teacher might give you some maybe Google Docs or something to be able to create your fairy tale, but here are some other as well. And that's it. So I am open to questions, and you'll have definitely all of these links and resources when you go to shellyterrel.com/fairytales.
She left?
Yeah, no, I'm still here. Sorry. I can put the camera and take off the.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, that might be better.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I hope that helped. I hope you're excited tonight. Anyways, great talking with y'all. Bye.
Just a second. So if you have questions, they will post the questions and I'll send them to you.
Okay, that sounds great. That sounds wonderful.
Again, actually, we have to go because we have other classes.
Okay, thank you. Bye.